Picture this. You're a young woman in occupied Europe, 1943. The knock on your door comes at dawn. SS officers drag you from your home, throw you into a cattle car with dozens of other terrified women. You think you are being sent to a labor camp. You have no idea that your destination is something far more sinister, something the Nazi regime tried desperately to hide from history. What I'm about to reveal challenges everything we thought we knew about the Holocaust. Hidden within the Nazi concentration camp system was a network of organized sexual slavery, so systematic, so bureaucratically managed, that it operated like a twisted business enterprise. More than 34,000 women were forced into this nightmare. Their stories were buried for decades, considered too shameful to discuss, too uncomfortable to confront. But the evidence is undeniable. SS documents, survivor testimonies, and decades of painstaking research have uncovered the truth. The Nazi regime didn't just murder millions, they created the most extensive system of state-organized sexual exploitation in modern history, and they did it with the same cold efficiency they applied to genocide. This isn't just another Holocaust documentary. This is the story of crimes so horrific that even hardened historians struggled to believe the evidence when it first emerged. Crimes that remained hidden in classified archives until the 1990s. Crimes that reveal new depths of Nazi depravity we're only now beginning to understand. The numbers alone are staggering. Over 500 military brothels across occupied Europe. At least 10 concentration camp brothels operating within the camp system itself. Thousands of women trafficked, tortured, and systematically raped by German soldiers, SS guards, and even privileged prisoners. Yet for 70 years, their voices remained silent. Today, that silence ends. The story begins in 1942, when Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS and one of the Holocaust's chief orchestrators, faced an unexpected problem. Productivity in concentration camps was declining. Worker morale among prisoners was low. More critically, German soldiers across occupied Europe were contracting venereal diseases from local populations, threatening military effectiveness. Himmler's solution was characteristically cold and calculated. Sexual services would be provided as incentives. Brothels would be established in concentration camps to reward productive prisoners. Military brothels would service German troops across occupied territories. The entire system would be managed with typical Nazi bureaucratic precision. The man Himmler chose to implement this plan was SS Dr. Siegfried Schwele, a fanatical Nazi who approached sexual slavery with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all aspects of the Holocaust. Schwele created elaborate rules governing every aspect of these facilities. 15-minute time limits per encounter. Strict racial segregation ensuring German prisoners could only visit German women. Polish prisoners, only Slavic women. Mandatory medical examinations. Detailed record keeping. Even the sexual positions were regulated. Only missionary position was permitted. Talking between prisoners and women was forbidden. SS guards watched through spy holes to ensure compliance. Shoes were not allowed on beds. Every aspect of human intimacy was stripped away, leaving only mechanized exploitation. The first concentration camp brothel opened at Mauthausen in 1942, following a personal visit by Himmler himself. The facility was built as a standard barrack surrounded by barbed wire, containing small individual rooms for up to 20 women. Female overseers, themselves prisoners, managed the daily operations under SS supervision. Within months, similar facilities appeared at 9 other major camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Auschwitz. Names that already carried the weight of unimaginable suffering now bore additional horrors. Block 24 at Auschwitz became one of the most notorious, operating within sight of the gas chambers and crematoria. The women forced into these facilities came primarily from Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp near Berlin. Between 1939 and 1945, nearly 120,000 women from across Europe passed through Ravensbrück's gates. Polish resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma women, political dissidents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and those the Nazis labeled as asocials. SS recruiters prowled Ravensbrück's barracks searching for suitable candidates. They sought women between 17 and 35 years old. Health and appearance were primary criteria. German nationality was preferred, though Polish, Soviet, and occasionally Dutch women were also selected. Jewish women were explicitly excluded under Nazi racial laws, though this didn't protect Jewish women from other forms of sexual violence throughout the Holocaust. The selection process was itself a form of psychological torture. Women never knew when SS officers might appear, examining them like livestock at auction. Those chosen were told they were being transferred for special work assignments. Many believed they were being sent to easier labor details. Instead, they were being processed for sexual slavery. Before assignment to brothels, selected women underwent preparation at camp hospitals. They received calcium injections, disinfection baths, better food rations, and time under sun lamps. This wasn't compassion. It was preparation for exploitation, ensuring the women appeared healthier and more attractive to their future abusers. The preparation process could last weeks. During this time, women slowly realized their true fate. Some attempted suicide. Others tried to make themselves appear sick or unattractive, but escape was impossible. The Nazi machine had claimed them, and resistance only brought punishment. Once transferred to brothel facilities, women faced a hellish routine. They were forced to service up to 32 men per day, with each encounter lasting exactly 15 minutes. Operating hours ran from 2 in the afternoon until 8:30 at night. The cost was 3 Reichsmarks per session, paid by prisoners using special coupons they earned through extra labor. The psychological impact was devastating. Women were forbidden from forming relationships with their abusers. They couldn't refuse clients. They had no control over their bodies, their time, or their fate. Many became pregnant despite precautions, and all pregnancies were terminated through forced abortions. Physical violence was routine. Guards beat women who violated any of Schwela's elaborate rules. Medical care was minimal. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly despite mandatory testing. Many women became seriously ill, and sick women were typically sent away from the brothels, usually to their deaths. The camp brothel system revealed the Nazi regime's obsession with control and hierarchy, even within their most dehumanizing practices. Access was restricted to privileged prisoners, primarily German capos and criminal prisoners who served as camp functionaries. Jewish prisoners were prohibited entirely. Soviet prisoners of war couldn't participate. The racial laws that governed all aspects of Nazi society extended even into organized sexual exploitation. Interestingly, the brothels failed to achieve their intended purpose. Prisoner productivity showed no measurable increase. Less than 1% of camp populations ever used these facilities. The elaborate system existed primarily to satisfy Nazi ideology about racial purity and social hierarchy, not practical concerns about worker motivation. Meanwhile, across occupied Europe, a parallel system of military brothels served German troops. These facilities were larger and more numerous than their concentration camp counterparts, with an estimated 500 locations operating by 1942. The women forced into military prostitution came from conquered territories across Europe, trafficked and enslaved to service the Wehrmacht and SS. The scale of sexual violence extended far beyond organized brothels. German soldiers routinely raped civilian women during military operations. The infamous Molotov Note of 1942 documented extensive lists of rape crimes committed by German forces across occupied territories. Soldiers branded captured partisan women with phrases like "whore for Hitler's troops" before assaulting them. This systematic sexual violence served multiple purposes within Nazi ideology. It was a weapon of terror designed to break the spirit of conquered populations. It was racial warfare, intended to humiliate and degrade peoples the Nazis considered inferior. It was a tool of genocide, targeting women's reproductive capacity and psychological well-being. The bureaucratic nature of these crimes is particularly chilling. Every aspect was documented, regulated, and managed through official channels. Orders came from the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Resources were allocated. Personnel were assigned. The Holocaust's machinery of death included systematic sexual exploitation as a core component. Yet, for decades after the war, these crimes remained largely hidden from public view. The silence wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, they found evidence of these crimes scattered throughout Nazi documentation. SS officers had attempted to destroy records, but fragments survived. Survivor testimonies emerged slowly, often decades later. Yet, for the longest time, these voices found no audience willing to listen. The women who survived faced a cruel paradox. They had endured unimaginable horrors, but their particular suffering carried a stigma that other Holocaust survivors didn't face. Society wasn't ready to confront the reality of systematic sexual slavery. Rape victims throughout history have faced blame rather than support. These women faced something worse: complete erasure. Consider Maria, a Polish resistance fighter sent to Ravensbrück in 1943. She survived the war, returned to her devastated homeland, and tried to rebuild her life. But how could she tell her story? How could she explain what happened in Block 24 at Auschwitz? The shame wasn't hers, but society placed it on her shoulders anyway. She lived 60 years carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. Maria's story mirrors thousands of others. Women who returned to families that couldn't understand their trauma. Women who faced suspicion rather than sympathy. Women who were told their experiences were too disturbing, too uncomfortable, too politically inconvenient to discuss publicly. The category of victims these women belonged to made their silence even more complete. Many had been classified as asocials by the Nazi regime. This included Roma and Sinti women, those who had turned to prostitution for survival, women from broken homes, anyone the Nazis deemed socially undesirable. After the war, these groups received no recognition as Holocaust victims. No compensation, no memorials, no voice. Jewish women faced different but equally devastating silence. The Nazi racial laws had theoretically prohibited German men from sexual contact with Jewish women under penalties for racial defilement. But these laws didn't prevent widespread sexual violence. They simply ensured that when it occurred, it carried additional layers of humiliation and terror. Dr. Sarah Goldstein, a Jewish physician from Vienna, documented her experiences at Auschwitz in a diary she kept hidden throughout her imprisonment. Her account, discovered in 1987, describes systematic sexual abuse by guards who justified their actions by claiming Jewish women deserved whatever happened to them. The racial ideology that marked Jews for extermination also marked Jewish women for particular forms of sexual violence. The communist governments of Eastern Europe had their own reasons for maintaining silence. The narrative of heroic resistance against fascism left little room for stories of sexual victimization. Women were supposed to be strong fighters against oppression, not victims of sexual slavery. The complexity of their experiences, the ways survival sometimes required impossible choices, didn't fit neat ideological categories. In West Germany, the economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s required forgetting uncomfortable truths about the recent past. Former Nazis had been integrated into government, business, and academic institutions. The last thing these reformed societies wanted was detailed documentation of Nazi sexual crimes that might implicate people still holding positions of authority. Even Holocaust research itself contributed to the silence. Early historians focused on documenting the scale of murder, the mechanics of genocide, the political and ideological framework of Nazi crimes. Sexual violence seemed like a secondary concern compared to the systematic extermination of millions. The very horror of the gas chambers overshadowed other forms of Nazi brutality. The breakthrough came in the 1990s, when a new generation of historians began asking different questions. Feminist scholars brought gender analysis to Holocaust studies. Survivors who had remained silent for decades began sharing their stories as they aged, recognizing their responsibility to historical truth. Archives that had been classified for national security reasons were finally opened to researchers. The first major academic study appeared in 1994, when German historian Christa Paul published Forced Prostitution, State-Built Brothels Under National Socialism. Paul had spent years tracking down survivors, piecing together SS documentation, and fighting academic resistance to her research. Many colleagues told her the topic was inappropriate, too sensational, not serious scholarship. Paul's work opened floodgates. Researchers across Europe began investigating similar crimes in their own countries. The Wiener Library in London started collecting survivor testimonies specifically about sexual violence. Museums began acknowledging these crimes in their exhibitions. Slowly, the historical record began reflecting the full scope of Nazi sexual exploitation. One of the most significant discoveries came from the Arolsen archives in Germany, which housed the world's most comprehensive collection of Nazi documentation. Hidden within administrative files, researchers found detailed records of brothel operations, medical reports on forced examinations, transportation lists of women being moved between facilities, financial accounts showing the profits generated by sexual slavery. These documents revealed the truly systematic nature of the crimes. This wasn't random violence by individual soldiers. It was organized, state-sanctioned exploitation, operating with the same bureaucratic efficiency as other aspects of the Holocaust. Orders came from Berlin. Budgets were approved. Personnel were trained. The Nazi state had industrialized sexual violence just as it had industrialized murder. The paper trail led directly to the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Heinrich Himmler's signature appeared on authorization documents. Adolf Hitler himself had been briefed on the brothel program. The sexual slavery system wasn't a side effect of war or occupation. It was deliberate policy, implemented as part of the broader Nazi vision of racial domination. Modern DNA analysis has provided additional evidence. Researchers studying the genetic legacy of Nazi occupation have found patterns consistent with systematic rape across occupied territories. Children born during the occupation years carry genetic markers that tell the story their mothers couldn't speak aloud. The testimonies that finally emerged paint a picture of calculated cruelty that goes beyond physical violence. Women described the psychological warfare employed by their captors, guards who would discuss their victims' deaths while assaulting them, officers who forced women to write letters home describing their supposed good treatment, the deliberate destruction of human dignity that accompanied physical exploitation. Anna Hoffmann, a German political prisoner who survived the Buchenwald brothel, provided one of the most detailed accounts when she finally spoke to researchers in 1998, at age 74. She described the daily routine of dehumanization, the way guards would inspect women like machinery, the complete absence of anything resembling human connection or compassion. But Anna also described something else, the small acts of resistance that women employed to maintain their sanity, secret codes they developed to warn each other of particularly violent clients, ways they sabotaged the system when possible, the friendships that formed between women who shared this specific form of suffering. These bonds often lasted long after liberation. Women who had been forced into the same facilities sometimes maintained contact for decades, supporting each other through the particular trauma they had shared. Their relationships became islands of understanding in a world that refused to acknowledge their experiences. The camp brothel system also revealed disturbing truths about collaboration and survival under extreme circumstances. Some women who worked as overseers in these facilities were themselves prisoners, forced to manage the exploitation of their fellow inmates. The moral complexity of these situations challenges simple narratives about victims and perpetrators. Recent research has identified 174 women by name who were forced into concentration camp brothels. Each name represents an individual story of suffering, survival, or death. Each name belongs to someone's daughter, sister, mother. The researchers who compiled these names worked for years, cross-referencing Nazi records with post-war testimony and immigration documents. The youngest victim identified was just 16 years old when she was selected for sexual slavery. The oldest was 38. Most were in their early 20s, chosen during what should have been the best years of their lives. Their average survival rate was significantly lower than the general camp population, reflecting the additional trauma and health risks they faced. What makes their stories even more heartbreaking is how close they came to being lost forever. By the 1980s, most survivors were elderly. Time was running out to collect their testimonies. Many had spent 40 years processing their trauma in silence before they could even begin to speak about their experiences. Others took their secrets to the grave, never finding the strength or opportunity to share what they had endured. The breakthrough moment came when researchers realized they were looking in the wrong places. Traditional Holocaust archives contained little information about sexual crimes because survivors had been reluctant to discuss these experiences with official historians. But in psychiatric hospitals, social services records, and private family documents, fragments of truth began to emerge. Dr. Elisabeth Kohler, working at a Vienna psychiatric facility in 1987, noticed patterns in the case files of elderly women patients. Many suffered from severe depression, anxiety disorders, and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Their symptoms were consistent, but their official histories made no sense. These women had supposedly worked in factories during the war, yet their psychological profiles suggested experiences far more traumatic than factory labor. Kohler began conducting informal interviews. Slowly, carefully, she created safe spaces for these women to speak. What emerged was devastating. Patient after patient revealed experiences of sexual slavery in Nazi facilities. Women who had carried these secrets for decades finally found someone willing to listen without judgment. The psychiatric dimension of these crimes reveals their lasting impact. Unlike other Holocaust survivors who could eventually find some measure of peace through commemoration and recognition, the women subjected to sexual slavery faced ongoing stigmatization. Their trauma was compounded by shame that wasn't theirs to carry, but which society had placed upon them. Medical records from the immediate post-war period show disturbing patterns. Women who had been in concentration camp brothels suffered significantly higher rates of suicide, depression, and what doctors then called nervous breakdowns. They struggled to form intimate relationships. Many never married or had children, their capacity for trust permanently damaged by their experiences. The physical consequences were equally severe. Forced abortions performed under unsanitary conditions left many women unable to conceive. Sexually transmitted diseases went untreated, causing lifelong health problems. The violence they endured resulted in permanent injuries that required ongoing medical care they often couldn't afford or access. What makes these medical records particularly heartbreaking is how they reveal the additional burden these women carried. Not only had they survived the Holocaust, but they faced unique challenges in rebuilding their lives. Society offered support systems for other survivors, but nothing existed for women whose specific trauma was considered too shameful to acknowledge. The Soviet liberation of camps in Eastern Europe created another layer of silence. Communist authorities were suspicious of anyone who had survived Nazi captivity, questioning whether survival indicated collaboration. Women who had been forced into sexual slavery faced particular scrutiny. Had they cooperated willingly? Had they received special treatment? The very fact of their survival became evidence of suspected betrayal. Katerina Volkov, a Ukrainian woman forced into a military brothel near Kiev, spent 3 years in Soviet interrogation centers after liberation. Her interrogators couldn't understand how she had survived when so many others died. They assumed survival meant collaboration. The idea that someone could endure systematic sexual violence and still resist in other ways was incomprehensible to them. Katerina's case illustrates the impossible positions these women faced. During captivity, survival sometimes required making choices that outsiders couldn't understand. Small acts of compliance that kept them alive were later interpreted as willing participation. The complexity of survival under extreme circumstances didn't fit neat categories of victim and collaborator. The children born from rape during Nazi occupation faced their own tragic circumstances. Thousands of women across occupied Europe became pregnant through sexual violence. Some children were killed at birth, others were abandoned. Those who survived grew up without knowing their fathers' identities, carrying the genetic legacy of violence their mothers couldn't discuss. Recent DNA studies across Eastern Europe have revealed the scope of wartime rape through genetic analysis. Researchers studying population genetics have found patterns consistent with systematic sexual violence during the occupation period. These genetic footprints tell stories that oral history couldn't preserve, providing scientific evidence of crimes that were never officially documented. The Norwegian Lebensborn program represents another aspect of Nazi sexual crimes that remained hidden for decades. German occupation forces were encouraged to father children with Norwegian women to increase Aryan births. While presented as voluntary, the reality often involved coercion, economic pressure, and outright rape. After the war, both the women and their children faced persecution from their own communities. Astrid Hansen bore a son to a German soldier in 1943. She always claimed the relationship was voluntary, but her diary, discovered after her death in 1989, tells a different story. The German officer had threatened her family with deportation unless she complied with his demands. For 46 years, she protected her son by maintaining the fiction that his conception had been consensual. The Lebensborn children faced lifelong discrimination. Norwegian society branded them as German bastards. The sins of their fathers visited upon innocent children. Many were placed in institutions, adopted away from their mothers, or subjected to medical experiments designed to study their supposed genetic superiority. Their suffering continued long after the war ended. France faced similar issues with children born to German fathers during occupation. An estimated 200,000 French women had relationships with German soldiers, though the extent of coercion versus genuine affection remains debated. After liberation, these women faced violent retribution from their communities. They were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, branded as collaborators. The moral complexity of these situations challenges simple narratives about resistance and collaboration. A French woman who entered a relationship with a German officer to protect her Jewish neighbors was simultaneously a hero and a collaborator, depending on perspective. The sexual dimension of occupation created gray areas that post-war justice systems couldn't adequately address. Archives across Europe contain thousands of files from post-war trials dealing with sexual violence during occupation. These documents reveal the systematic nature of these crimes, while also showing how difficult they were to prosecute. Witnesses were reluctant to testify. Evidence was often destroyed. The legal frameworks of the time struggled to address crimes that mixed military occupation with sexual violence. The Nuremberg trials, despite their groundbreaking approach to international justice, largely ignored sexual crimes. Rape was not explicitly listed as a crime against humanity in the tribunal's charter. Prosecutors focused on murder, deportation, and slave labor, treating sexual violence as a secondary concern. This legal precedent contributed to decades of silence about Nazi sexual crimes. Justice for the women forced into Nazi brothels remained elusive long after the war ended. The perpetrators were rarely prosecuted specifically for sexual crimes. SS Dr. Siegfried Schwela, who designed the concentration camp brothel system, was tried for war crimes, but his sexual slavery program was barely mentioned in the proceedings. He received a relatively light sentence and was released after serving just 6 years. The guards who managed these facilities often disappeared into post-war chaos. Some fled to South America. Others assumed new identities. A few were captured by Allied forces but were typically prosecuted for general war crimes rather than specific sexual offenses. The legal system's failure to address these crimes compounded the victims' suffering by denying them formal recognition of their experiences. Compensation programs established in the decades after the war systematically excluded women who had been subjected to sexual slavery. German reparations focused on documented slave labor, political persecution, and racial deportation. The social category that included many brothel victims received no recognition. Women who survived these crimes received no financial support for their ongoing medical and psychological needs. The German Democratic Republic, established in East Germany, created its own compensation system that was equally inadequate. Communist ideology emphasized heroic resistance over victimization, making it even more difficult for survivors of sexual violence to obtain recognition. The state's official narrative of anti-fascist struggle left no room for stories that complicated the simple division between heroes and villains. West Germany's approach was marginally better, but still deeply flawed. The Federal Compensation Law of 1953 theoretically covered all Nazi victims, but bureaucratic requirements made it nearly impossible for sexual violence survivors to qualify. They needed documentation that rarely existed, witness testimony from people who were often dead, and medical evidence of injuries that had healed decades earlier. The few women who managed to navigate these bureaucratic obstacles faced additional humiliation during the application process. Officials questioned whether their suffering qualified as persecution. Medical examiners demanded detailed descriptions of sexual violence that re-traumatized survivors. The compensation system became another form of victimization, forcing women to prove their suffering to skeptical bureaucrats. Legal recognition finally began changing in the 1990s, when international law evolved to treat rape as a war crime and crime against humanity. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia established crucial precedents by prosecuting systematic rape as genocide. These legal developments came too late to help most Nazi sexual violence survivors, but they validated the seriousness of crimes that had been minimized for decades. The documentation that finally emerged painted a picture of systematic brutality that extended far beyond the concentration camp brothels. Military records revealed standing orders encouraging German soldiers to view rape as acceptable behavior in occupied territories. Field reports described sexual violence as a normal part of military operations. The Nazi war machine had weaponized rape as deliberately as it weaponized murder. Today, these stories finally have witnesses. The 174 women we can name by their research represent thousands more whose identities remain lost to history. Their suffering was real. Their resistance mattered. Their survival against impossible odds stands as testimony to human endurance in the face of systematic evil. We cannot bring back the decades of silence these women endured. We cannot undo the shame that society wrongly placed upon their shoulders, but we can ensure their stories are told with the dignity they always deserved. We can recognize that sexual violence was not a footnote to the Holocaust, but an integral part of Nazi crimes against humanity. The bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Nazi sexual slavery should serve as a warning. Evil rarely announces itself with dramatic speeches or obvious symbols. More often, it operates through administrative orders, budget allocations, and systematic policies that reduce human beings to numbers in ledgers. The same bureaucratic machinery that organized deportations and murder also industrialized rape and sexual slavery. Understanding these crimes matters because the patterns repeat. Sexual violence remains a weapon of war in conflicts across our world today. The systematic nature of Nazi sexual crimes provides a template that other regimes have studied and adapted. Only by confronting the full scope of historical atrocities can we recognize their modern manifestations and work to prevent them. The silence that surrounded these crimes for 70 years teaches us about the power of shame to suppress truth. Societies chose to ignore evidence that was uncomfortable, politically inconvenient, or morally challenging. The same dynamics that kept Nazi sexual crimes hidden continue to silence survivors of sexual violence today. But the breakthrough in documentation during the 1990s also demonstrates that truth eventually emerges. Researchers who refused to accept official narratives, survivors who found courage to speak despite decades of silence, and institutions willing to confront uncomfortable histories made this revelation possible. Their work reminds us that historical truth requires constant vigilance and courage. The names we now know, Anna Hoffman, Maria, Katarina Volkov, Astrid Hansen, represent millions of women whose stories remain untold. Every armed conflict, every occupation, every system of oppression creates similar victims whose suffering society prefers to ignore. Recognizing Nazi sexual crimes is not just about historical accuracy, but about acknowledging patterns of violence that continue today. The evidence is overwhelming. The documentation is undeniable. These crimes happened with the same systematic efficiency that characterized every aspect of the Holocaust. 34,000 women minimum were forced into state-organized sexual slavery. Hundreds of thousands more faced sexual violence during military occupation. Their experiences were not aberrations, but deliberate policy implemented at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. We remember them not just as victims, but as individuals who maintained their humanity under impossible circumstances. Women who formed friendships in brothel barracks, who developed secret codes to protect each other, who found ways to resist even when resistance seemed futile. Their survival was itself an act of defiance against a system designed to destroy them completely. Their legacy challenges us to be better witnesses, more careful historians, more compassionate societies. The shame was never theirs to carry. The silence was never justified. The forgetting was never acceptable. Today, finally, we remember.